everybody. I'm your host, Brittany Jones-Cooper, and welcome back to Build. Today, I'm sitting down with Amanda Edwards, a native Texan and Houston City Council member who is running for U.S. Senate. As an attorney and community advocate, Edwards has a crowded primary race ahead of her, but is staying focused on empowering her constituents to get the results they deserve. Please put your hands together for Amanda Edwards.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. First, how are you doing? I know you've been traveling around a lot, getting the word out. How you feeling?
I'm feeling great. We're actually getting close to our early voting. It will start February 18th. The primary is March the 3rd. Wow. So we are trying to get people energized, not just locally in the state of Texas, but nationally, because this is such an important seat nationally. If we can flip this seat, we are going to shift the balance of power in this country.
Which is huge. And I've been asking a lot of people about their 2020 resolutions. Yours seems a lot more important.
Yeah, it's certainly a big one. I will say that.
Some people are like, drink more water. You're like, I'm trying to shift the nation, guys. We've got big goals in 2020.
Absolutely, but it's so many people that are counting on us to do that. There are hundreds of bills right now on the desk of, right now, the Senate Majority Leader. We cannot allow people's lives to be in the balance as people are playing politics. We need people who are focused, committed, but also who can be effective. Because again, I like to tell people, it does you no good just for me to give you a rousing speech if I don't deliver on that speech. You've got to get folks who can deliver and have that laser focus and ability to be effective.
And I've researched you a little bit, and I have seen your ability to deliver, which has been really kind of reaffirming for me, even though I don't get to vote in Texas. But, I like to find candidates who you can see are sort of like looking forward. And so you've been on the city council now for 4 years?
Yes, so I've been serving on the city council for 4 years. I just finished up my service as a city council member. That's about 2.3 million Texans. So for those that question, they say, well, how do you make a leap from city council to the U.S. Senate? Well, first and foremost, that's about a quarter of the Democratic base of Texas is right there in the constituency that I have been representing when I was serving as a council member. The second piece of this is this. Having someone who's been on the ground, who walks in the homes of people who understand what it means to have Harvey damage, who understands what it means to have policy fail on the ground, and then be able to then fix those problems or those loopholes or those gaps, or advocate for more funding for the services that people actually need. The further we get removed or the higher the title gets, oftentimes people get lost in that process. And so bringing the people to the forefront and bringing them to Washington with you, carrying those stories with you, and that conviction, but then an ability then to make the difference that they're counting on you to make is exactly what we need at this time, especially right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to know a little bit more about how you got to this point where you are now, because obviously we're going to talk about what's coming for you, but I want to know, how does a girl from Texas decide, yeah, I want to get into politics? You went to Emory, you went to Harvard Law. And then what was the shift after that into, I want to have a life in politics?
Yeah, so, honestly, service has always been something I was interested in terms of being interested in helping other people, empowering other people. I think over time that interest matured and the focus of what service was really going to be about changed in its manifestation. But when I was at Emory, I was doing stuff at Emory in terms of making sure that people understood the connection between policy and the work that we were doing as we were community building and social change fellows. I was one of the first fellows they had in that program. In fact, it was Kenneth Cole. He had the fellowship. And so we were focusing on working in communities and you have to understand it's not just about what your ideas and those are what's best. It's about, have you engaged those residents? Do you have their trust? Do you have their buy-in? There's a difference between just having a ribbon cutting and a long-term sustainable change instead. And that's when you bring residents to the table. So I got to do that work at Emory. I worked on the Hill, got to work for Congresswoman Jackson Lee on the Hill, and I think that experience showed me that community needs are urgent. They wouldn't be calling your office if they didn't really have a need. And that's something that I think is lost sometimes in the shuffle of who's occupying what office. And then, of course, at Harvard, I watched when Hurricane Katrina happened and the folks in New Orleans were being rescued off their rooftops. And so I decided to move down to New Orleans. So after I graduated, I always have to tell people I graduated because they say, did you just leave?
Like, no, I went.
I did go, but I finished school first. And then I went down to New Orleans and I started a program for kids teaching them how to use writing as a tool of empowerment. And I was clerking in federal court. And I then realized that you don't just have to have a physical storm for there to be need in a community. We all have storms in our lives, right? So if you really want to have that impact, you can do that in a variety of ways and in a variety of spaces. So I came back home to Houston. I started practicing law, and I was serving on a bunch of nonprofit boards. And I was always still interested in public service, but to be honest with you, I cannot stand politics. And for the reasons that most people don't like things about politics, right? The lies and it's just over sensationalized. I mean, there's just so much to it that's not appealing. But ultimately, I think for me and understanding what my purpose is, I had to understand that it wasn't good enough for me to dance around my purpose. I needed to be someone who was living out that purpose. And for me, that happens to be being in a space where I was needed in terms of servant leadership, someone who could be effective at empowering people and empowering communities rather than being on the outside of that looking in. And so for me, that didn't mean that I got to be in a space that I was most comfortable, right? I had to leave that comfort to go in a space where I think my talents and my skills were most needed. And that's, I think, something personally that we have to all reconcile within ourselves. But once I jumped in, I haven't looked back.
You haven't looked back. Your track record is really great from what I've read in interviews with other people. But you've had to now reach outside of Houston, right? Because you're running for U.S. Senate. And so what sort of work have you done on the ground? Have you been knocking on doors in other cities? It sounds like it's maybe been a busy couple of months.
When I tell you the state of Texas is big.
It's real big.
You get to know that when you are campaigning.
I've driven through Texas twice.
Oh, so you know that
south,
firsthand. It is
like 2 days.
Yes, it is a huge state. And one of the things that I'm committed to doing is making sure that before we start asking you for votes, let me go here and hear what your concerns are. Let me actively engage you. Let me actively listen. Let's bring you to the table so that we can have solutions that we're all excited about and can be proud of and have ownership in. So we've been going to big markets like Dallas and San Antonio and Austin and, of course, Houston, and small markets like mid-sized markets and smaller ones like Lubbock, a little town called Caldwell. I mean, you name it, we are all over the place. We've gone to dozens and dozens of places across Texas because we have to hear first. And now, of course, we're getting people activated because now it's election time. But the last thing that I ever wanted, and in fact, this was part of my motivation for running, was for anybody to think that this, for me, was about just getting elected to office. For me, this is about building what we call a people-powered movement where we're listening and bringing people in. But then, in addition to that, making this about them and empowering them in this process, because the power is really in their hands in terms of who they select as their leader, but also what we do once one is selected. Don't let a Democrat or a Republican get in an office and be someone who's not fulfilling the promises they make while they're on the campaign trail. I believe that wall between the campaign trail and service, meaning governance, has to come down. What I say out of my mouth, I have to be willing and committed and able to be effective at delivering. And that's when you restore confidence in democracy rather than erode it. And so this is about more than just my election. Now, trust me, I want you to elect me. I want everybody to make sure I want to be the next U.S. Senator. So I want to get elected, but that's been part of the problem, is it just is about elections so much of the time, and you leave your communities left with empty promises, and they're waiting on that delivery still. And so part of when I got into the office, I'll share this, when Harvey happened in 2017, that's 51 inches of rainfall that came across the city of Houston. That was a lot of rain. And in so much so that this was the second worst disaster in U.S. history in terms of dollars and cents, billions of dollars of damage. And someone asked me to go and check on some of our low-income seniors on one side of town. I said, sure, no problem. And I would knock on the door, and they'd let me in, and I start talking to them about what they were doing to clean out, and they'd tell me. But when I'd ask them, what are you doing to remove the furniture, they'd say, oh, my grandchild is coming. But when I'd ask them, what are you doing to remove the walls? In each of those houses, house after house after house, they'd say to me, well, those walls are already dry. And as you probably might know, that's gonna mean mold infestation. So that broke my heart. But of course, I wasn't elected to be heartbroken. I was elected to do something. So we mobilized hundreds of volunteers to go door to door and check on some of these seniors, get them connected to volunteers that could help them. In doing that work, I'd wear my shirt, not my campaign shirt that looks like that, but I would wear my shirt that said I was an elected official. And one of the first things that people would ask when I'd I stepped foot on those doorsteps was, oh, well, are you up for reelection? Right? Because they weren't used to seeing their elected officials show up and deposit. It was usually used to seeing people come in and ask for that vote. We know how to find your house when it's election time, but it's time to start finding people's homes when it's time to deliver on the promises from election time. And that's what I'm bringing to the table. And that's something that really is something that sits deep within me as a motivation to change this paradigm of dysfunction, because that's what it is.
And your intention seems so pure and amazing, but you're in a fight. I mean,
yeah.
The primary, there's 12 of you in the primary.
12.
And from reading the local news stories, and I'm starting to see people coming out with their daggers and trying to put you in boxes. And are you prepared for this real battle?
Are you kidding me? I've been serving on city council. Listen, we have something called public session every Tuesday, and that means whomever signs up on that list, they can say whatever their heart's desire. So they might get on film and camera and blast you and tell you the worst person that ever stepped foot on earth, or they might hug you and thank you for your service, and you have to be prepared to deal with it all. The point of it is politics is a dirty game, right? We know that, but I understand that politics is a means to a much more significant end, which is about serving the people who need us to serve them. So when I think about access to healthcare or economic opportunity in our country, and how many people are really counting on us to do our jobs, not counting on us to talk about a job and not counting on us to give a speech. Doing the job means that something has changed in my life. Doing the job means I now have opportunities that I didn't have before you were in office. That's doing the job that people need us to do. So when you're talking about life and death issues, like when I was growing up, my dad was diagnosed with cancer. I was 10, and he passed away from it when I was 17 years old. But that's how I learned what healthcare access was in our country, because I would ask my dad, I said, well, this insurance stuff, because he explained what insurance was and how it worked. And I said, well, are they going to cover this? Because my dad was getting experimental treatments at the time. And my dad would say, well, we'll have to find out. But I said, well, what if they say no? And my dad would say, well, we'd have to figure something else out. And I said, well, what if somebody can't figure something out? I was one of those kids who never stopped asking questions.
Me too.
And so I'd ask him, I said, well, what if somebody can't figure it out? What happens next? And the truth is, that's a life or death answer for people all across America. It's not just in Texas, it's everywhere. And you need folks who understand that, who've lived that experience, take that with them and understand we cannot afford to wait 5, 6, 7 years to debate healthcare access. We've got to deliver now because their lives hang in the balance now. So when I think about those types of issues, it allows me to be able to power through the politics and the dirty politics that we'll face.
Would that be one of the first issues you wanted to lend your kind of attention to if you were elected to the U.S. Senate?
Yeah, absolutely.
Healthcare. And would it be expanding on the Affordable Care Act?
Expanding and repairing, because there's some challenges with the Affordable Care Act that you have to expand coverage, make it more affordable. There should be a public option, affordable public option available. That was the initial intent in the first place. We should have that. That allows people to have the flexibility of keeping their private insurance if that's what they want, their doctors, because that was a response. People said, you told me I wasn't going to get my doctor switched. People were mad. So again, back to those community building principles. You got to listen to what people are saying to you. You have to hear their voices. They've said to you, some have said, I want to keep my insurance, or I want to keep my doctor. Fine. We have others who have said, this still doesn't work for me. I can't afford this exchange. So for the first time, because now I've left office, I've signed up for the Affordable Care Act. And for me, I'm a lawyer. I'm saying to myself, oh, this is expensive. And I'm saying that as someone who's been out in the workforce for years and all these things. And I can't imagine for someone who has not been making sustainable wages to now be faced with paying that kind of money on a monthly basis in terms of their health care coverage. We've got to get something that's affordable. We got to drive those premium costs down. We have to close the loopholes that have been created or expanded for short-term insurance when people think they're going to get one thing and then they end up needing treatment and not getting it at all. That's the challenge that we have to face. So those are some of the areas that we've got to fix, making sure that you have the options. And then I think it's something that we can buy into now. And that's the key piece, because Yeah, I was talking to a lady the other day who was a cancer survivor, and she told me, thank you for taking your stance, because I would not be here right now if I didn't have access to the Affordable Care Act, and I'm hopeful that it continues to exist and be improved. That's what she looked at me. This woman's telling me about a life or death saving moment for her. That's the urgency with which we need to treat this.
And another big issue is gun control. It's a huge national issue, but Texas gets a lot of attention, especially after Beto O'Rourke's comments. Now, he decided not to enter the race. So I want to know, what sort of impact did him not have, like entering the race, have on the rest of you, especially when he brought up such a big issue and took such a strong stance? Has it kind of forced you guys to make that a big issue during this campaign?
I think it was a big issue regardless of Beto being in the race or not, because of the fact that in the last few months there have been multiple mass shootings in the state of Texas.
El Paso and Odessa.
Yes, in fact, I was heading. It was so ironic. I was heading to Midland, Odessa area. I'd already checked into my flight when the shooting took place, and I had a dilemma, a crisis of conscience. I said, "Do I go, or do I cancel the trip?" Because you're talking about lives lost. Those bodies hadn't even been buried. And so I can't come in here in this community and make it political, because that's not appropriate. These are human lives at stake. And so I weighed it, and I said, I'm just going to go and speak to these young people, because it was actually the Young Dems statewide were having a meeting, and they asked me to be their speaker. And I came, and I am so grateful that I had that moment with them, because they had trauma. That was, in fact, they were locked down. Even though none of them had been shot, that was trauma for them, because they were fearful of what was going to happen, who was going to barge in. We can't live in conditions like that. And so that's been taking place right during this very election cycle. We had the El Paso, Midland, you have had a recent church shooting. We've had a lot of things, and truth be told, we haven't done very much of anything. Columbine happened when I was in high school, and we're still talking about the exact same stuff. And I've been out of high school a long time, and we're not getting anywhere here. We've got my opponent, my general opponent, and John Cornyn, who has maintained an A+ rating with the NRA. And I'd like to tell people, I have made good grades in my life, but I will not be making an A+ from the NRA, because there are lives that are lying in the balance. We need sensible gun policies like background checks. These are 90% of Americans agree with that. 90%, and we can't get a background check. Red flag policies, looking at how you restrict the accessibility of these weapons of war. I mean, there's just a variety of things that we need to take seriously, because people are losing their lives, and it's not just in mass shooting contexts. Because I want to highlight that I've lost a loved one, a member of my family, due to gun violence when I was young, and people get killed, murdered. There are suicides that are rampant. It's so much that's taking place. And for us to stand by idly and not pass any policy, and one of the things that's troubling for some that say, oh, well, it's, there are concerns about mental health and other things. Well, it's not mutually exclusive. If you want to add to a package of many things, then do that. That's called leadership. But to stand back and say we're not going to even have a background check, it's easier for you to get a gun than it is for you to drive an Uber. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? Like it's some of the stuff is just a little off kilter in terms of just where we are with policy and politics. That's politics taking precedent over people. And that's what we have to reverse, and that's why I'm running.
Do you think that Texas is ready? We saw with Beto and Ted Cruz, it was a close, very national race, got a lot of attention. It sort of signaled that Texas might be ready for a Democratic change. Do you think Texas is ready?
I would not be running if I didn't think Texas was ready. It is absolutely ready. It's been accelerated, I think, by the 2016 cycle. Just since 2016, we've seen 2.6 million new registered voters in Texas, of which 1.6 million of those newly registered voters are people of color and or under the age of 25. So Texas is changing. The cities are continuing to grow. And then you're also seeing this kind of shift happening within kind of the partisan political landscape. In other words, a lot of people are now beginning to identify as independents who might otherwise have been Republicans, but more in the conservative, like fiscal conservative sense, not necessarily some of the Tea Party type of discussion that has been so commonplace. And so what you're seeing is people are willing to try something different. Beto did a remarkable job in the 18 cycle of getting people who were independent voters, or what we call persuadable voters. They don't typically vote Democratic, but they might if you talk to them and if you engage them. And he got so many of those folks coming on board. He did a remarkable job. But what we did also see in the 18 cycle was that there were some votes left on the table. When we looked at it closely, we saw that communities of color, high registration levels, but less than 50% of those that were registered came back out and actually voted. Same thing happened with communities under the age of 35. So if you can have, and oftentimes when you see that kind of disconnect, a lot of the time it's people not believing that it's really going to make a difference in their lives still. And so there's that cynicism there about what is it going to mean for me. So if you have a person that can come in who can get those folks who are in the middle back engaged, say, don't be discouraged by 18, come on back, get them engaged, which my politics will allow me to do. But then also speak to those communities of color and those people under the age of 35 who had an interest but somehow thought it might not make a difference in their lives, and tell them why they should believe you. Because they're going to ask you, why should I believe you? How are you different?
Yeah.
And the answer is, don't just take my word for it. Ask the people I've served. The people I served will tell you how on the ground that I've been in communities of color or marginalized populations or folks under the age of 35. The communities I've served will tell you that I mean business when I talk about results. I'm dealing with issues like small business owners not having access to capital. Minority business owners are 3 times less likely to gain access to capital, like a loan, a traditional loan, than their non-minority business counterpart. That means you got to get rejected 3 times as much. How many people are going to quit? And on that second rejection, a lot of people. We can't continue to have those kinds of disparities. So someone who's been doing that work, and then that person being that messenger and tell you it will be different this time, because that is in fact what it's been for the communities that I've served. So I'm excited to be that messenger. I think we can build these coalitions. If you just do one thing, if you just get the folks in the middle, you won't have enough votes. If you just galvanize the base, you won't have enough votes. But if you get those coalitions that I just described to you built, and you get all of those and you add them up, we will have enough votes to unseat John Cornyn, and you'll be looking at and sitting with your next U.S. Senator.
Whoa, that's exciting. I like that vibe. Let's go to the audience. We do have a couple of questions before we get out of here.
On that note, future Texas Senator-elect Amanda Edwards.
I like that. Thank
Has a
you.
nice ring to it, right? I just want to tell you, you are an inspiration to women, to the Black and brown community, but most of all to people who desire change for a better future. I wanted to ask you, being as though you were on the city council, what more responsibility will you endure as a senator, and what more can the people of Texas expect from you to bring that the other senators at current have not brought to the table?
Thank you for your question, and thank you for your encouragement. One of the things I think is critically important is to understand the value of the pocketbook. So where you put your money where your mouth is. And so right now we've got an infrastructure across our nation that's crumbling. Our nation's infrastructure is crumbling, and you don't see resources coming down to rebuild that. We're going to have bridges crumbling down, people dying. It's got to get so crisis level, but it's so easy to see right here and now that we are not doing the work needed in order to make sure we're keeping people safe. So infrastructure investment is key. Another thing, we have something called CDBG the CDBG dollars, which are community development block grants. That allows the localities, the municipalities, the towns, the cities, whatever, to use those grant dollars to restore and revitalize and improve their communities. There are economic development dollars associated with that. Housing, affordable housing, quality affordable housing is at crisis level in our country, and we've got to protect and put resources behind that to make sure. So I think people will appreciate that I understand what happens on the ground, what the gaps really are, and then therefore can correct course in terms of what needs to be funded, what needs to be supported on the ground. Even when we talk about criminal justice and police and issues of policing, right? We'd like to talk about community policing. Well, part of community policing requires some resources that mean that you have more training and then you have more officers being able to engage and be part of communities. Well, if you're not funding that and you're not providing additional resources that can make that available, then you're going to continue to see that adversarial relationships. Now, some of this is leadership, of course, but the other component is resources. You got to give people the tools that they can utilize to be successful. So there's so many things that happen on a day-to-day that if they were being properly or adequately funded up top, and it's not just the healthcare and economic opportunity pieces, but some of these kind of what seems to be local issues, a lot of them can be bridged by virtue of just simply having the federal support that is now lacking. Great question.
Has a Black woman run for U.S. Senate in Texas?
I will be the first Black woman senator from the state of Texas. So it's exciting, and I know, and it doesn't, it's not missed on me that people are looking at this race and saying, hey, that means I can do that too. And I know that when you are opening a door, it's so important not just to open that door for yourself, but you keep that door open. And you keep that door open and that flow of change open. So I hope not to just be the first. I hope to be the first of many to follow. And that's the piece of this that I think is important. And when you start, people can visualize change, then change will then in fact result.
Absolutely.
Hi. Besides politics, what other things can all of us in this room and all of those at home do to enact change within their community?
Well, great question. I think one of the things I was really involved in before I transitioned into public service was really the civic engagement in terms of the nonprofit spaces. So I found what I was really deeply passionate about. So I love dealing with community, as you've probably figured out with all my hand gestures. But I love dealing with community, and I had this awesome opportunity to work with a nonprofit. It was called Project Row Houses that was doing using art as a means to transform the community. So they were they have these art houses. They were bringing people out for that. They were doing affordable housing. They were doing a lot of different transformational pieces of work in the community. So I found that board, got really, really engaged, and did some others like that. So even if it's not politics one-on-one, like in the traditional sense, is service nevertheless. So find the ways that you can serve, that you could do for countless hours without compensation or pay and be deeply rewarded by doing it. And a lot of times when people serve on boards and they say, well, which board should I be on? Who's on that board and who's on that board? And I say, just follow your heart. What is your personal purpose and what is your personal mission? Figure what that out is. And some people got to figure it out. Maybe some of the boards will help you figure it out. You're like, oh, I thought I wanted to deal with education, but it actually makes me not really want to work in that space. Maybe that's, you have to be able to give yourself the flexibility to figure out or navigate what your passion is. But then once you figure it out, work to contribute in solving challenges in those areas on the ground and through the nonprofit space is an excellent, excellent way to do that.
I've interviewed another Texan, Cecile Richards, and she wrote this book called Make Trouble. And I think in reading that, I realized how important a community organizer is and how valued that role is. And if you're really looking for a way to get involved in your community, people are seeking out people who really want to take on those roles. Kind of inspired me because you kind of think like, oh, somebody else is going to do it, somebody else is going to do it, but...
And they're not.
And they're not. Yeah. Just for me, I want to know, what are you watching on Netflix?
I'm not watching much Netflix right now, y'all.
What do you do in the little free time that you do have?
Honestly, and I can only answer the question honestly. I don't have very much free time at all, but I try to sneak in my friends from time to time. So I have this cool group called Women for Amanda, and I'm shouting them out. But I have some really good friends who have been really helpful in that. So we get some girlfriend time in and laugh and talk a little bit when we're working. So we try to sneak it into the campaign trail, and every once in a while they'll literally call my campaign and say she needs to have dinner with us, so do not schedule her. So they'll force friends. Yes, they're good friends, and they'll force me to take a moment. It doesn't happen often, but just every once in a blue moon. So I'll have those moments. And, balance is something that sometimes can be fleeting, but I think in this case, a campaign is not the space probably where you get the most balance, but, the reward is so great to me when I'm in the community and somebody feels inspired by something I've said or shared, or they begin to really understand the power that they harness. Because I always talk about how President Obama talked about the power lies in the hands of the average ordinary American citizen. And I love to share that with people, because then it empowers them to say, yeah, I'm in charge. Because you really are. You just kind of haven't recognized that you're in charge. And if you don't like what you see, then change it. And it's not a matter of they or the system. Vote is a vote. As long as you can get yourself to the ballot box, you can get yourself a vote. And then if you want to convince your friends and use your social media to do the same and that's how movements get built. One person at a time.
And money is a huge part of it. So
Oh, yeah.
we mentioned your primary race is very hot and heated. You make it through the primary. That journal is going to be hard to. John Cornyn is an establishment Republican. He's got a lot of money to spend. So how can people help you out in Texas?
So we need people to donate, and they don't have to live in Texas. Money is green. Anybody in the country can donate. Just give online. I tell people, whatever your little coffee habit is on whatever days you have it, just give it to me instead. Give it to me.
Drink green tea instead.
That's right.
And donate to Amanda
and
Edwards'
then
campaign.
donate to me instead. But that's huge, because every time we take a trip, every small town I visit, every big town I visit, it costs money. It's gas. It's, accommodations, with, all of the things. And so it takes support. So we need that support. Go to www.amandafortexas.com. And you can also follow us on social. I'm also Amanda for Texas as well. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. But beyond that, just giving, that's key. The other thing is sharing. A lot of people don't even know about this race. So you extending this platform and the people in this room following me on social, and then I've got the launch video that you guys showed. That's kind of a trailer for what our movement is about. Show that to somebody, and somebody say,
I'll show it to people.
That's
okay?
right.
I'll
Just
do
start
that.
sharing
and
it.
then I'll go to amandafortexas.com and donate some money. You guys can do that too.
That's right. I see the heads nodding.
Yes,
That's
heads
good.
are nodding. Guys, give it up for Amanda Edwards.
Thank you.
Thank you.